I have been asked in the years since what it felt like to not know something. This is a difficult question for a Chthon surgeon to answer because our education is designed specifically to prevent that feeling. We do not sit with ignorance. We name it, locate it, schedule its removal, and fill the gap with structured study until the gap is no longer there. That is how our colleges work. That is how our guild examinations work. That is how 6 campaigns of field surgery worked for me, not by exposing me to chaos and asking me to improvise, but by drilling procedure into my hands until procedure was the automatic state and improvisation was the exception that never quite arrived. I operated on Chthon soldiers under orbital fire at the 3rd relay. I worked inside a flooded corridor on the wreck of the survey transport Ivule Vass, and did not lose the patient despite the water being at my secondary joints. I performed a full cavity closure in the back of a moving freight hauler during the Von Lowland withdrawal, with nothing more than field instruments and a clamp improvised from a support strut, while 2 of my junior surgeons held the patient still with their own body weight. After 6 campaigns, I believed I understood what field medicine looked like when it had nowhere left to go. I believe this precisely the way all surgeons of long experience believe it, with a confidence that has been tested enough times to feel earned, and not quite enough times to be humble. I want to be clear about who I was before I met Korsman Davrius and his card, because who I was before matters. It matters because the thing that happened to me in that relay station was not dramatic in the way that surgeons sometimes describe their educating moments. No flash of insight, no sudden clarity, no revelation arriving like light through a split hull. What happened was slower than that, quieter. It was the specific feeling of reaching for a procedural handhold that should have been there, and finding instead a worn, bloodied, illegible smear, and having to decide in the space of about 3 heartbeats what to do about it. And then having the decision made for me by a half-conscious human whose hand moved before his eyes were even properly open. That is the story. Everything around it is context. The Von Terrace campaign had been running for 11 weeks when the Drev sovereignty punched through the eastern fortification line at Ancrez. I will not give a full account of the battle. I was not a soldier, and did not see it as soldiers see things. But what I can tell you is what arrived at our forward triage station in the 4 hours after the breach, because what arrived was the residue of a route that should not have been a route. The Drev sovereignty's hereditary war caste are not subtle fighters. They do not outmaneuver. They do not encircle and starve. They come through things because for 600 years that has been sufficient, and at Ancrez it was sufficient again. The eastern wall came down in sections over the course of about 90 minutes, and then the Drev were through, and the coalition forces, human soldiers and Chthon support units, and 2 platoons of Shurav auxiliaries, were pulling back through the terrace's rubble in whatever order they could manage. Our triage station was in what had been a relay post for courier drones, a long stone building with a partial roof, positioned far enough back from the line that we had expected it to remain functional. The Drev breakthrough changed that calculation. By the time the first wave of casualties reached us, the roof had 3 large gaps in it from long-range artillery, and the afternoon sun was coming straight through them in thick column shafts, filling the room with a flat white light that was bright enough to work by and bright enough to make everything slightly overexposed, the way a burn victim's skin can look too vivid to be real. The stone floor was warm from the sun. Dust moved in the shafts. My 2 junior surgeons, Penn Aelith and Drew Sova, were already working when I arrived. Penn was on her 2nd patient. Drew had just lost one and was setting up for the next with the careful, contained discipline of someone who has decided not to feel it yet. We worked through the first 2 hours on Chthon soldiers and Shurav auxiliaries, which I will not pretend was easy. The Shurav have a cardiovascular arrangement that requires specific pressure management during hemorrhage control, and 2 of their wounded presented with injury patterns I had not seen before, but it was work I understood. I had the instruments for it. I had the vocabulary for it. My hands knew the shapes. The Shurv, I should say, are a difficult patient population even under ideal conditions. Their circulatory fluid is maintained at a higher pressure than Chthon blood, which means that what looks like a manageable wound on a Chthon patient becomes a high-pressure bleed on a Shurv almost before you can assess it. The first Shurv I treated at Ancrez had a penetrating injury in his lateral thorax that was seeping quietly when the support unit carried him in, and became an aggressive hemorrhage within about 90 seconds of my assessment, which was not enough time to complete the assessment. I finished the assessment while managing the bleed simultaneously, which is technically possible and professionally inadvisable, and exactly the kind of thing that happens in forward triage when the casualty rate is higher than the surgeon-to-patient ratio can accommodate. I did not lose him. Drew came over to assist on the pressure management, and I got both hands free for the assessment, and we managed it. The second Shurv was easier because I had just learned something from the first. That is the particular economics of forward field surgery. Every patient teaches you something, and the currency of that teaching is the patient's risk during the lesson. You become better at a cost that is distributed across the people you work on, some of whom do not survive the process of making you better. I have thought about this for 30 years and have not found a more comfortable way to describe it. You try to minimize the cost. You fail sometimes. You try to minimize the failing. That is the whole of it. The humans began arriving about 90 minutes in. There were 14 of them in the first group, brought back by a Chthon support unit that had found them dug into a rubble pocket about 400 meters east. Most were walking wounded, cuts, percussion injuries, 3 with extremity trauma that was serious but manageable. Coalition field protocols gave human soldiers basic Chthon physiological training for exactly this kind of situation, and the human corpsmen in their unit had already done good initial work. Pressure applied, airways cleared, the critical cases flagged and carried. 2 were carried. One of the 2 was Corpsman Dav Rius, which I did not know at the time because I did not yet know his name. I knew only that he was human, male by their categorization, wearing Coalition Medical Corps insignia, which was the first thing I registered because a Coalition Medic's insignia means the patient has a kit. They carry it on their person, locked to a chest attachment point, precisely so that any surgeon who receives them also receives their reference materials and medical history. Coalition protocol. Sensible. I had used human medic kits before, 3 times in the field, and found them generally adequate for the information they carried. His kit was still attached when they set him down in the shaft of sunlight nearest the east wall. He was unconscious but breathing. A Drev impact round had caught him in the right side at the transition between his thoracic and abdominal regions, which in Chthon anatomy would be relatively survivable depending on what had been disrupted. I did not know enough about human anatomy to make the same assessment quickly. I knew the broad architecture, their single cardiovascular pump, their bilateral lung arrangement, their regionalized digestive system, the approximate positions of their major vessels relative to their skeletal landmarks. I did not know the precise topography, the exact location of the major vessels in this part of a human body, the likely cascade pattern of a Drev round at this energy and angle, what a human system would do in the next 15 minutes if I did not intervene correctly. What I did know was that his kit would tell me. Coalition medic kits are standardized across species with inserts for each biological category. Human medics carry human inserts, physiological charts, drug interaction tables, procedure guides for the most common field trauma types. I had been told this in training and seen it verified in practice. I unlocked the kit from his chest attachment, laid it open on the clean cloth I had already set on the floor beside him, habit, always the clean cloth first, and found the human insert packet inside the left inner compartment, exactly where protocol placed it. The insert packet contained several laminated cards and 2 data chips. The data chips were useless to me. I had no reader for the human chip format, but the laminated cards were physical documents, and I can read the Coalition Common Script well enough for medical purposes. There was a cardiovascular chart, a drug dosage table coded by body mass, a triage priority decision tree. And there was a procedure card, a single laminated sheet, printed on both sides, hole punched in the corner and attached to the inside of the kit lid with a short metal ring clip, so that it hung open and available when the kit was in use. Procedure card for thoracoabdominal trauma, human physiology, 22 steps. I want to describe the card precisely, because the card is the thing. It was not new. It had been used many times, I could tell, because the lamination had small stress fractures along the fold lines, and the clip hole had been reinforced twice with adhesive patches. Someone, Rios himself, presumably, since it was his kit, had written additional notes in the margins of several steps in a very small, very neat hand. An alternate drug name above the printed one, a dosage adjustment, a timing note at step 14 that said faster than listed if secondary symptoms. The margins were dense. The card was the product of experience being layered onto the printed original, the way a tool gets worn into the shape of the hand that uses it. I began at step 1. Steps 1 through 4 were assessment steps: check for this, palpate for that, measure the other. I could do this. I had the instruments. His readings went on the cloth beside him in a row: pulse rate, pressure estimate, the visual assessment of the wound site. Step 5 called for a specific pressure application to the wound margin. Step 6 was an airway check. Step 7 involved a drug administration. I had the drug, or a Kethon equivalent the Coalition pharmacological tables listed as acceptable for human use, and I administered it. Steps 8 through 11 were the hemorrhage management sequence, which was the critical piece, because the Drev round had done internal work and the question was what and how much and in what order to address it. I want to say something about what it is to work from a procedure card in the field, because there are people who imagine that field surgery is a matter of instinct and improvisation, and that the card is a kind of crutch for the undertrained. This is not accurate. The card is the accumulated product of everyone who has treated this kind of injury before you, every error they made and corrected, every technique they tested and found better or worse than the one before it. The card is the consensus. When you work from a procedure card in a forward triage station, you are not working from a script. You are in active conversation with every surgeon who contributed to the document, which is a form of consultation that is available to you even when no living specialist is present. The card knows things you do not know. Trusting the card is not weakness. Trusting the card is how you access a store of knowledge larger than your own. This is what I believed and still believe as I began to work through the steps. Step 8 was legible. Step 8 told me to locate and occlude the primary vessel disruption before addressing secondary bleeding. Step 9 was not legible. Step 9 was a smear. Not the whole step. The step number was clear, and the first 3 words were clear, and then there was a region approximately 3 centimeters wide where the ink had been transferred by something, by a bloody finger, by the card being pressed against a wet surface, by some moment of trauma or urgency that I would never be able to reconstruct, and the smear ran through the middle of the step's instruction like a pale, rust-colored river, and left the critical procedural content unreadable. I could see that there were words beneath the smear. I could not make out what they were. I stayed very still for a moment. This is not something that happens to a Kethon surgeon of 6 campaigns. I do not mean that arrogantly. I mean it technically. Our procedure cards are triple redundant, stored in physical and digital format with a backup card in every kit for exactly this reason. We plan for the card to fail. We plan for the drug to run out, for the instrument to break, for the reader to go dead. We plan for these things so that when they happen, we are not still, we are already moving to the backup. I did not have a backup for step 9. The card was the backup. The card was what I had. Step 10 was legible again. Step 11 was legible. The procedure continued past the gap as if the gap were not there, which made it worse, because I could see where I needed to be and could not see how to get there. Step 10 assumed that Step 9 had been completed correctly. The specific vessel work that Step 9 described, the location, the access method, the technique, was the bridge between the assessment of Step 8 and the secondary management of Steps 10 and 11, and without it, I was standing on one side of a gap looking at the other side and trying to decide whether to jump. The afternoon light shifted a degree or two while I held the card. Outside the broken wall, I could hear the sounds of the terrace, the distant percussion of Drev artillery still working on the eastern line, the nearer sounds of people moving through rubble, the particular flat quality that large, empty spaces have when they are full of something happening. Pen was working 5 meters to my left, and I could hear the specific, precise sounds of her instruments without any of the words, which is a sound I know the way I know my own voice. Drew was working at the far end of the room where the sun came through the northernmost gap. Rias was breathing. I was holding a card. I made a decision. It was not a good decision, but it was the one I had available. I would extrapolate from steps 8 and 10, construct the probable procedure of step 9 from what the surrounding steps implied it must have done, and execute that. This is not recommended technique. It is, however, what field surgeons sometimes do, and I had 6 campaigns of experience informing the extrapolation, and I began. He moved. Not violently, he did not sit up, he did not speak, he did not do any of the things that would have told me clearly that he was conscious. He moved the way a person moves in deep sleep when something reaches them through the depth, a slight shift of the right shoulder, a subtle tension change across the upper arm, and then his right hand, which had been lying open-palmed on the stone floor beside him, lifted, slowly, without urgency. It lifted the way a hand lifts when the body has been asked to do something familiar, something practiced, something that lives in the muscles below the level of thought. It rose to the height of the kit lid. His eyes were still closed. His breathing had not changed. Every indicator I was watching told me he was not conscious in any meaningful sense, and yet his hand was rising toward the open kit, and it reached the kit lid, and it found the card. I did not move. I do not think I breathed. His index finger extended and made contact with the card surface. It rested there for a moment, just resting, the pad of the finger against the laminate, and then it began to move. Slowly, deliberately, tracing. He was tracing step 9. The finger moved through the smear, through the rust-colored fog that had swallowed the words, and it moved along a specific path, not randomly, not groping, but precisely, following the contours of letters that were invisible to me and evidently visible to whatever part of him was still operating beneath the surface of unconsciousness. The finger moved left to right, paused at a point that felt like a comma or a transition, moved again in a shorter arc, paused, completed a final motion that covered what I estimated was the remaining third of the step's instruction. And then his hand lowered back to the floor and lay open-palmed again. I looked at the card. The smear was unchanged. The step was still illegible. His tracing had left no mark. I looked at his hand. I looked at his face. His eyes were still closed. I thought, he has just shown me something. I was not certain that was true. I am a field surgeon, not a philosopher, and the rational interpretation of what had just happened was that a semi-conscious patient had exhibited a reflexive motor response triggered by proximity to a familiar object, and the specific path of that response was coincidental, and I should not derive procedural instruction from the reflexive motor behavior of a man who was not in a state to consent to giving it. This was the rational interpretation. I held it for a moment, and then I set it aside. He had traced step 9. He had traced it in the air above the card, with the card in front of him, following the path of words he could not see, but apparently had memorized past the threshold of conscious recall. He had done it the way I imagine a surgeon who has performed a procedure 10,000 times might guide a student's hands in the dark, not from thought, but from somewhere else, from the place where procedure has gone when it becomes the body's own property. I followed his trace. I will not describe the procedure in technical detail, because it is not the technical detail that matters. What matters is that I followed the path his finger had drawn, the length of the motion, the pause at the transition point, the shorter arc, the final sweep, and translated that into the corresponding physical action at the wound site, using my best interpretation of what a finger trace of that shape and that duration, drawn above a line of coalition medical text, probably meant in terms of the procedure being described. I did not know if I was right. I was as close to not knowing as I have ever been in a surgery, and I continued. Step 10 followed cleanly from what I had done. Step 11 followed from step 10. Step 12. He stabilized. Not immediately. These things do not happen immediately, and I will not compress the next 40 minutes into a sentence, because those 40 minutes were their own education and deserve their own account. The body's passage from crisis to stability is not a switch that throws but a slope that levels, and watching it level, step by step, reading the indicators and not letting yourself believe what they're saying until they've said it for long enough to trust. This is where the patience of a field surgeon is tested differently than it is during the acute work. During the acute work you are moving. During the stabilization watch you are still, and stillness in a triage station requires a different discipline than motion. The noise continues outside. The other patients make their claims. Penn called to me twice about the sure of auxiliary she was managing, and I answered both times without fully turning away, which is a skill you develop or you lose patience to inattention. But through all of it I was watching Rios, watching the indicators, watching the slow leveling of the slope. I was also in the gaps between readings, watching his hand. Not because I expected it to move again. I did not, but because the hand had become, in the space of about 4 minutes, the thing in the room that I understood least, and a surgeon who does not understand something will look at it. The hand was ordinary in every observable way. The skin was the particular color and texture of a human male of middle years, slightly roughened at the knuckles, a small scar across the back of the index finger's first joint that had healed cleanly without a surgeon's attention, which is the kind of detail you notice when you've spent long enough looking at wounds and their aftermaths. The fingernail was short and clean, the way medical corps personnel are trained to keep them. The hand lay open on the stone, palm up, in a relaxed configuration that suggested the tendons had settled rather than been arranged. It looked like any hand. It told me nothing about where it had been, a few minutes before, or what it had known when it got there. I took one more reading from the indicators beside him. The numbers were going the right direction. I let myself, for the first time since I had opened his kit, take a breath that was not in service of the immediate problem. Penn called again. I went. When I reached step 22 and stepped back from the patient and let Penn Aileth take over the monitoring while I cleaned my instruments, Corpsman Dav Rios was breathing in a pattern that suggested he intended to continue doing so for the foreseeable future. His hand was still lying open on the stone floor, palm up, in the column of afternoon sun. I stood at the window for a while. The wall beside my workspace had a gap in it, not a window by design but a window by the Drev's artillery work, and through it I could see the terrace outside, the broken stone paving, the heat coming off it in the afternoon light. I have stood in a lot of windows after surgeries and looked at things that had nothing to do with medicine. I think all surgeons do. There is a particular emptiness that follows the kind of concentration that surgery requires, a brief interval where the mind is very quiet and not yet ready to be filled with the next thing. Usually, I fill it quickly. I have a list in my head, always the next patient, the next task, the instrument count, the drug supply check, and the quiet interval rarely lasts more than a few moments before the list reasserts itself. This time the quiet lasted longer. I was thinking about step 9. I was thinking about the fact that I did not know what step 9 said. I had followed the path his finger drew, and the patient was alive, and I still did not know what the step actually contained. I could not reconstruct it from the outcome, because a step in a medical procedure does not leave a legible trace in the body. A body stabilized can be stabilized in many ways, and the specific mechanism of step 9 was not something I could reverse engineer by looking at the result. The result told me that something had worked. It did not tell me what. This bothered me in a way I did not immediately recognize. I am by training and temperament a person who resolves uncertainty. When I do not know something, I find out. When a procedure is unclear, I locate the source documentation. I contact the guild registry. I run the simulation. I ask the specialist. I fill gaps. It is, as I said, what we are trained to do, not to sit with not knowing, but to abolish not knowing through systematic inquiry. And yet here was something I could not abolish. I could not ask the patient. He was unconscious and would be for some time. The card was unreadable. The data chips were inaccessible. The other coalition medics in the station were not medical corps. They were line soldiers with basic cross-training, not specialists in human trauma procedure. I had followed a trace I could not read, and it had worked, and I did not know why. And I found, standing at the gap in the wall with the sun on my secondary joints and the dust moving in the light behind me, that I was not as bothered by this as I should have been. That is what surprised me. I had expected the not knowing to feel like an emergency, like a hole in my procedure, something requiring immediate correction. Instead, it felt like standing in a room and realizing the wall you thought was solid has a window in it that you never noticed. Still a wall, still holding, but with light coming through. I went back to work. We treated 41 casualties in that relay station over the next 8 hours, and I will tell you honestly that I do not remember most of them individually. That is not callousness, it is triage. You manage a volume that is larger than individual memory can hold, and what you retain is the shape of the day, not every face in it. I remember the shore of auxiliary with the collapsed secondary lung. I remember the Chthon lance sergeant whose left manipulator had been severed and who refused sedation because he said he needed to be able to shout orders, and I told him that being sedated did not prevent shouting, and he tested this theory twice during the procedure. I remember Penn losing her second patient of the day and handling it with a stillness that told me she had learned the lesson earlier in her career that experience does not make loss smaller, but does make the interval between loss and continuing work shorter. I remember those things. I remember Rias coming back to consciousness at the 4th hour. He came back the way some patients do, not in a sudden return but in a gradual surfacing, first the eyes moving under the lids, then the lids themselves, then a long unfocused interval where he was clearly present but not yet oriented. Penn was monitoring him at that point. I heard her say something in Coalition Common, which she speaks better than I do, and heard him answer in a voice that was very quiet and very dry, and then she called me over. He looked at me for a moment when I crouched beside him. He had very direct eyes, a dark brown that the afternoon light made warmer, and he used them with the economy of someone who was currently conserving energy for things that mattered. He looked at the instruments beside him. He looked at his own kit, which I had resecured to its chest mount. He looked back at me. Chthon, he said in Coalition Common. His pronunciation was good. Yes, I said. You worked on me. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, not resting, processing. There is a difference, and I had learned to recognize it. The card, he said. Yes. Step 9. I had not said anything about Step 9. I did not know how he knew. He did not explain how he knew. He simply said it, Step 9. The way a person says the name of a thing they have been thinking about without realizing it. The way a name surfaces from wherever it has been waiting. Then he closed his eyes again, not unconscious but simply done, and I sat beside him for a moment that stretched longer than I intended. When I was certain he was resting properly and not deteriorating, I unclipped the card from his kit lid. I want to be precise about what I did, because I want you to understand that I thought carefully about it. Taking the card from a patient's kit without their explicit consent is a professional impropriety. The card is their property, their reference material, their annotated and personalized field guide. I had already used it without consent in the only way that had mattered, which was unavoidable, but removing it was something else. I held it for a moment and looked at the smear at step 9, at the pale rust-colored fog of it, the words underneath that I could almost convince myself I could read if I looked at the right angle in the right light, and consistently could not. And I made a decision that I have not entirely justified to myself in the years since. I took out a clean card from my own kit and copied, as precisely as I could, the full text of the procedure card, every step I could read, every marginal annotation, every timing note in Reis's small, neat hand. I copied the blank space at step 9. I copied the smear itself as well as I could by making a mark on my copy that replicated its shape and size and position. Then I returned the original to the kit and reclipped it, and I kept my copy. I have thought about why I kept the copy. The professional answer is that I wanted the procedure reference for future human casualties, which was true and was sufficient justification in itself. The real answer is that I was not ready to be finished with step 9. I had followed a trace I could not read and achieved a result I could not fully attribute, and something in me was not willing to let that go until I understood it better. The copy was the way I kept the question open. Reis was evacuated on the second day, when the coalition re-established a corridor through the terrace's southern edge and the medical transports could get through. I saw him once more before he left briefly, as they were moving him to the transport, and he was sitting up on the stretcher with the careful posture of someone managing pain by distributing it evenly, and he looked at me and nodded once. I nodded back. That was all. He did not ask what I had done with step 9, and I did not tell him. The Vaughan Terrace campaign ran for another 4 weeks after the battle at Ancres. The Drev sovereignty made 2 more attempts to retake the terrace and failed both times, less because of anything we did than because their hereditary war caste operates on a timetable that does not accommodate sustained attrition. They expect rapid victory, and when it does not come, the internal political pressure to redeploy is significant and eventually irresistible. They withdrew in the 34th week. The terrace remained with the coalition. We lost more people in those 4 weeks than we had in the first 30, which is the specific arithmetic of campaigns that have already been decided but have not yet acknowledged it. I treated 63 casualties in those 4 weeks. Human soldiers were the largest single category. The human light infantry units had taken the heaviest role in the final defensive actions, and they paid for it. I was working with human physiology more than I had in any previous campaign, and I became better at it, which was both professionally necessary and personally uncomfortable in a way I did not have language for at the time. When I treat a Chthon patient, I am treating something I understand completely. The physiology is mine. The failure modes are known. The protocols were written by Chthon surgeons for Chthon bodies, and when I follow a step on a procedure card, I know precisely what the step is asking me to do and the why is not a mystery. I have the whole picture. I work from inside the picture. When I treat a human patient, I am working from the edge of a picture I can see the outline of but cannot fully enter. I have the charts. I have the procedure cards. I have the reference materials. And they are good materials. The Coalition Medical Corps is genuinely excellent, and the documentation they produce is thorough and field-tested and written for exactly the situation I found myself in, which is a non-human surgeon treating a human patient without the luxury of time or a specialist. The materials are good, but I am reading them from the outside, and reading from the outside is different from knowing from the inside. And in 63 patients over 4 weeks, I kept finding the edges of what the materials could tell me, and the margins where I was working from inference rather than certainty. I kept finding step 9. Not literally, I encountered no other unreadable cards in those weeks. What I found was the functional equivalent, the moments in each procedure where the documentation met its limit, and the surgeon had to bridge a gap from her own understanding, her own interpretation, her own judgment applied to a body that was not the body she was trained for. Every surgeon finds these moments. What I had not expected was how often I would find them with human patients, and how different those moments felt from the equivalent moments with Chthon patients. Because with Chthon patients, my judgment in those moments draws from the same source as the documentation, the same physiology, the same failure modes, the same architecture. When I fill a Chthon gap from inference, I am inferring from within. When I fill a human gap from inference, I am inferring across. The distinction matters more than it sounds. Inferring from within is a closed system. I bring my knowledge to bear on a problem that shares the same foundation as my knowledge, and the probability that my inference is correct is relatively high because the source of the inference and the object of the inference are made of the same material. Inferring across is an open system. I bring my knowledge to bear on a problem that does not share the same foundation, and every inference I make is a bridge built from one kind of material to span a gap on the other side that may require a different kind entirely. The bridges hold, often. They hold well enough. But they hold differently than they would if the inference were closed, and I could feel the difference in those 4 weeks in a way I had not been equipped to feel before on Krez. There is a professional humility that is easy to perform and very different from the kind you actually inhabit. The performed kind says, I acknowledge the limits of my knowledge. The inhabited kind says, I feel those limits in my hands while I work in real time, as a specific texture of uncertainty that is different from the uncertainty I feel when working within my own physiology's known failure modes. The performed kind requires saying the right words to the guild registry once a year. The inhabited kind arrives in a forward triage station when the card is unreadable, and the patient is breathing, and the afternoon light is coming through a hole in the roof, and you have about 3 heartbeats to decide what to do. The Vaughan Terrace gave me 4 weeks of the inhabited kind, consecutively, which is more than most surgeons receive in a single campaign, and I was a different surgeon at the end of it than I had been at the beginning. Rias's hand had shown me something. I had been inferring from outside, and I had been doing it in the only way I knew how from my own knowledge, my own training, my own interior picture of what a surgical step should look like. And Rias's hand had shown me that there was another way to fill the gap, not from the surgeon's knowledge, but from the patient's. Not from the record, but from the body that the record was written about. A human's procedure, drilled into a human body through repetition and practice, and the accumulated pressure of however many campaigns and training cycles and rehearsal sessions it had taken to make a particular set of motions no longer feel like a set of motions, but simply feel like what the hands do. That procedure, held in a human body past the depth of consciousness, is not the same thing as the documented record of that procedure. The record is a translation. The body is the original. And when the record fails, the original does not necessarily fail with it. The original is held in a different kind of storage, maintained by a different kind of system, and its availability does not depend on the legibility of the document. I have been trying to say this precisely for 30 years and have never been fully satisfied that I have managed it. What I mean is this. When Rias's hand rose from the floor and traced the invisible path of step 9 above the unreadable card, it was not doing something mysterious. It was doing something quite ordinary, if you understand what ordinary means in this context. He had performed that procedure enough times in practice and in the field that his body held the sequence the way a musical instrument holds the shape of the notes that have been played on it, the groove of the practice thing, worn smooth by repetition, until the repetition is not repetition anymore but simply the shape of the thing. His hands knew step 9 the way my hands know the Chthon closure sequence, not as information, but as fact. as something that does not require looking up because it has become its own reference. What was not ordinary was that I was there to observe it, and that I had the presence of mind, or the desperation, which may be the same thing in a forward triage station, to follow it. The Vaughan Terrace campaign ran for another 4 weeks after the battle at Ancres. The Drev's sovereignty made 2 more attempts to retake the terrace and failed both times, less because of anything we did than because their hereditary war caste operates on a timetable that does not accommodate sustained attrition. They expect rapid victory, and when it does not come, the internal political pressure to redeploy is significant and eventually irresistible. They withdrew in the 34th week. The terrace remained with the coalition. We lost more people in those 4 weeks than we had in the first 30, which is the specific arithmetic of campaigns that have already been decided but have not yet acknowledged it. I treated 63 casualties in those 4 weeks, human soldiers the largest single category, and I will not give you each of them because that is not what this account is about. What I will tell you is that I thought about Step 9 throughout. Not obsessively, I am a working surgeon with too much to do for obsession, but persistently. The way you think about a fact that has not yet finished being a fact, that is still in the process of becoming something you understand. When I treated my human patients in those 4 weeks, I was more careful than I had been before. Not more technically careful, my technique did not change. More attentive, more present in the moments where the documentation met its edge. More willing to slow down, to watch, to let the patient tell me something before I decided I already knew it. This is not easy to do in a forward triage station, where the patient is often unconscious and the time pressure is real. But it is possible, and I did it, and I believe it made me a better surgeon of human patients in those 4 weeks than I had been in the entire campaign before Ancres. Whether that is because of what Ries's hand showed me, or because of the 63 patients themselves and the volume of direct experience, or because of some combination that I cannot separate out, I cannot say with certainty. A surgeon of 30 years should probably be more certain about things than I am. I have found that I am not. When I was certain he was resting properly and not deteriorating, I unclipped the card from his kit lid. I want to be precise about what I did, because I want you to understand that I thought carefully about it. Taking the card from a patient's kit without their explicit consent is a professional impropriety. The card is their property, their reference material, their annotated and personalized field guide. I had already used it without consent in the only way that had mattered, which was unavoidable, but removing it was something else. I held it for a moment and looked at the smear at Step 9, at the pale rust-colored fog of it, the words underneath that I could almost convince myself I could read if I looked at the right angle in the right light, and consistently could not. And I made a decision that I have not entirely justified to myself in the years since. I took out a clean card from my own kit and copied as precisely as I could the full text of the procedure card, every step I could read, every marginal annotation, every timing note in Ries's small, neat hand. I copied the blank space at Step 9. I copied the smear itself as well as I could by making a mark on my copy that replicated its shape and size and position. Then I returned the original to the kit and reclipped it, and I kept my copy. I have thought about why I kept the copy. The professional answer is that I wanted the procedure reference for future human casualties, which was true and was sufficient justification in itself. The real answer is that I was not ready to be finished with Step 9. I had followed a trace I could not read and achieved a result I could not fully attribute, and something in me was not willing to let that go until I understood it better. The copy was the way I kept the question open. He was evacuated on the second day, when the coalition re-established a corridor through the terrace's southern edge, and the medical transports could get through. I saw him once more before he left briefly, as they were moving him to the transport, and he was sitting up on the stretcher with the careful posture of someone managing pain by distributing it evenly, and he looked at me and nodded once. I nodded back. That was all. He did not ask what I had done with Step 9, and I did not tell him. In the years that followed, 3 subsequent campaigns, a garrison posting at Veth Station, a 2-year residency at the Coalition Joint Species Hospital at Ondara, I treated human patients more times than I can accurately count. I became genuinely competent with human trauma physiology, which is to say I arrived at the point where the documentation no longer felt like I was reading from the outside of something, but from a position of informed familiarity that was not quite the same as knowing from within, but was no longer the same as standing entirely at the edge. It is a particular satisfaction, building that kind of competence, slower to build with a foreign physiology than with your own, requiring more conscious effort per patient for longer, but arriving eventually at a place where the effort becomes less conscious and the familiarity more automatic. I thought about Step 9 throughout all of it. Not obsessively. A working surgeon with too much to do cannot sustain obsession on a single procedural question, but persistently. The question never resolved. It merely settled, the way sediment settles, from an urgent turbulence to a constant quiet presence at the bottom of everything. I have had opportunities to find out. I could have looked it up in the Coalition Medical Database. It is a documented procedure. The card is a standardized Coalition document. The specific content of every step is archived. I have had access to that archive for years. I have deliberately not looked it up. I want to be honest about that. I have chosen, consciously and repeatedly, to not find out. And when I have examined that choice, which I have done often enough to understand it, what I find is this. If I look up Step 9, I will have the words. The words will be correct and specific and professionally useful, and I will read them and understand them and add them to the interior picture I carry of human thoracoabdominal trauma procedure. This will be good. This will be the right professional outcome. But the words will not be what Rios gave me. The words will be the record, and what he gave me was the original, and those are not the same thing. And if I have the words, I will have replaced the original with the record, and the record, correct as it is, does not carry the weight that the original carried. The weight came from the fact that it was his. That it was in his hands, not in the documentation. That it had been put there by every time he had practiced, and every time he had applied it, and every time he had stood in a gap somewhere and found, without looking at the card, that his hands already knew where to go. The weight came from the act of watching a man's body know something his mind was not present to confirm. That is not in the archive. That cannot be looked up. I am aware that this is an unusual position for a cathon surgeon to hold. We fill gaps. We do not preserve them. We are not sentimental about ignorance. I am aware that there is something professionally unbecoming about a surgeon of my experience, saying that she has chosen to remain uninformed about a step in a documented procedure for reasons that amount to a kind of respect for a thing she cannot fully name. I know what my guild supervisor would say. I know what most of my colleagues would say. I also know what Rios's hand said, and I have found that harder to argue with. He recovered fully, which I know because he sent a formal communication to the Cathon Medical Corps through coalition channels about 8 months after the Von Terrace campaign. I was not accustomed to receiving formal communications from patients I had treated in the field. It is not standard in either medical tradition, and when it arrived I read it 3 times before I understood what it was. It was, essentially, a professional citation. He had documented what had happened in the relay station and submitted it to coalition records, which meant it was credited to my file and eventually contributed to a commendation I received 2 years later for cross-species surgical practice. The commendation is a small metal disc. I keep it in my kit. The communication did not describe Step 9. He did not explain it, and he did not ask if I wanted to know what it contained. He wrote in formal coalition comment that the procedure had been completed correctly, and that he understood the conditions under which I had been working, and that he wished to confirm the outcome for medical record purposes. He wrote that the Kethon Medical Corps had always been a reliable partner in coalition field operations, and he hoped that continued. He wrote that the condition of the card was a personal matter, and he had taken steps to address it. He wrote nothing else. I read the last line of that several times. The condition of the card was a personal matter, and he had taken steps to address it. I have imagined what that means. I have imagined him sitting somewhere in a medical corps barracks, or on a transport, or at a desk in some garrison posting, with a new laminated card and the old smeared one beside it, deciding what to do, reprinting the step, copying it out in the same small, neat hand he used for the margin annotations, relaminating, reclipping to the kit lid, his hands moving through the preparation of the thing, which is a kind of practice of its own. And whether he copied the step from memory, from the archive, from another card, whether the copy he made was the record or the original, or whether by that point the distinction had ceased to matter because the record had long since become the original, I do not know. I did not ask. My junior surgeons have asked about the card. There is always a stage in a junior surgeon's development when they begin to notice the details of their supervisor's practice, the specific instruments you prefer, the order in which you set things out, the small personalizations that accumulate in a kit over years of use, and they ask about these things, partly from curiosity and partly from a kind of professional hope that the details contain instruction. The card is the most unusual item in my kit, and it generates the most questions. I tell them the following, that the card is a procedure reference for human thoraco-abdominal trauma, and that I carry it because I treated a human patient under difficult conditions early in my career and have found it useful since. This is true. I tell them that Step 9 is unreadable, and that this has not impeded my ability to treat human patients effectively in the years since. This is also true. I tell them that in field surgery, you will encounter gaps in your reference materials, and the question is not whether you will encounter them but what you will do when you do. This is the most important thing I tell them, and I tell it to all of them, and it is true in the most general sense, and I mean it sincerely. I do not tell them about Rius's hand. I have tried, several times, to find the right way to explain it to a junior surgeon, the way to make it a lesson rather than a story, the way to put it in terms that are professionally actionable rather than merely interesting, and I have not managed it. The fact of it resists the form of instruction. A hand rising from the floor in the afternoon light to trace the outline of a thing it knew, and I did not. This is not a technique. It is not a protocol. It is not something I can teach them to replicate or something they can practice until it lives in their muscles the way a procedure does. What I can say is this. 6 campaigns of field surgery had convinced me that what I did not know was a problem to be solved, and a gap to be filled, and that the filling was my work, and the gap was my failure until I had filled it. And then a man I had never met traced a line I could not see, in the air above an illegible card, and showed me something I have been trying to articulate ever since. Not that ignorance is acceptable, it is not, and I have not stopped trying to know more about human physiology in the years since, and I never will. But that what a person knows deeply, what they carry in their hands in the practiced motion of a thing done until it is no longer done but simply is that knowledge is not the same as the record of it. And when the record fails, that other knowledge is sometimes still there, in the hands, in the body, available to whoever is present and paying close enough attention. The card is in my kit. Left inner compartment, directly inside the first flap, laminated now. I laminated it myself, at the Joint Species Hospital, because the copy I made in the field was on plain paper and was beginning to degrade. The lamination makes it feel more like the original than it did when it was just paper, which is a strange feeling. The smear at Step 9 is still there, reproduced from the copy I made in the stone building with the sun coming through the broken roof and the dust moving in the columns of afternoon light. It is a mark I made with deliberate attention to its size and shape, trying to reproduce faithfully the thing that could not be read. I have opened that kit thousands of times in the years since and have looked at that card thousands of times and have read steps 1 through 8, 10 through 22 correctly and in full, and have looked at the smear at step 9 and have gone on. Step 9 is still unreadable. The smear has not faded. I have not looked it up.